Good evening. My name is Bill Edgett. Tonight, Benjamin Abganti and myself have the opportunity to introduce Alexandra Lysova. Alexandra Lysova is a researcher from Simon Fraser University in the field of intimate partner violence. Thank you both for coming in here this evening. And Alexandra, I'll turn it over to you so you can give us a little more information about yourself and your research.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much, Ben, for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be on this show. I do research on intimate partner violence and domestic violence at Simon Fraser University in the School of Criminology. And I've been studying domestic violence for the past 20 years. And I started doing this work back in Russia, where I focused on violence against women and children. And men's issues are and have been and still are hardly discussed. So in this presentation today, I would like to share with you the results of my work on intimate partner violence, primarily in Canada, the work I'm doing in the past 13 years. And I've been focusing on men's issues and men's victimization. And in fact, I want to see this issue as a part of the complex picture of domestic violence. It's important not just to focus on men or focus on women separately. It's really important to look at domestic violence as a complex phenomenon and to understand that by helping all the victims that suffer in the relationship and looking into the complex dynamic, this is how we can help the families and the children involved in violence between the partners. And now I'd like to actually try to show you my presentation. Yeah, I can see it now. So a couple of words probably. Male victims of intimate partner violence and homicide is a difficult topic to discuss. Some consider it as a controversial issue, and that stops some researchers from actually joining this area of research because it's difficult. There are some barriers to studying this issue, and it is difficult. And I will show in my presentation the potential causes and explanations for why it is seen often as a controversial topic, and why it's not actually controversial, but it's just a human issue, and we have to try our best to help all victims of abuse, including men. And again, talking about male victims, it does not mean that we ignore the suffering of female survivors or don't play the experiences. Women do experience severe intimate partner violence, including homicides, at a much higher rate than men do. But at the same time, it is very important to pay attention to all victims involved in the violent intimate relationship. And as I've mentioned before, only by looking at the complex picture, trying to understand the complexity of intertwined relationship, we can actually try to address domestic violence better. So when people usually hear the words domestic violence or intimate partner violence, what kind of impressions they usually have? So in other words, what's the perception of domestic violence? And many studies on perceptions show that people usually think immediately about violence against women. So men are perpetrators of abuse and women are victims. And these messages are abundant in the media, in the research, in the entertainment. This is what first comes to mind. Even when individuals are presented with the information that it's not only women who suffer from domestic abuse, but it's also men, individuals usually have this idea that maybe, even if it's true, then consequences of abuse are much more severe for women, or they experience as a much more serious issue than men do. So again, they find their way to explain it kind of that it has very different impact on women than on men. And of course, whenever facts are there that the men suffer from abuse, psychological, physical, sexual, then other type of attitudes comes to play, something like don't worry, boys are just supposed to like this, or they just don't experience violence in the same way. They just don't care that much. It's not severe enough. So we see this kind of downplaying the effect of abuse on men. And this is something that is one of the issues to studying domestic violence or intimate partner violence against men. So I've actually tried to look into the issue, what are the sources of this for this controversy in studying male victims of domestic violence. And again, these are some of my ideas. Being in the field quite alone, I came up with several explanations. So one of them is focus on violence against women as the major mainstream theoretical framework within the area of domestic violence. I show here just several titles of the fundamental works in the area of domestic violence from the 70s and 80s. And this is what laid out the foundation for the entire area of domestic violence as a research area and then as a practical area. So focus on fighting for the equal rights with men, looking at the feminist explanations of domestic violence with a focus on patriarchy and control on men's part, and poor or women who lack power in the relationship. So you see feminist perspectives on wife abuse were prevalent and still very prevalent. It has the name of gender perspective, or you can also hear the name gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is the term coming from the feminist perspectives because the focus is on violence against women there. So it doesn't mean that it's gender-based, it's based on any gender. It's basically focusing just on women. So that was a bit confusing to me, and now I understand that this is how it's defined, not quite as it sounds. And then within the feminist background, whenever women perpetrated violence, it was explained as self-defense and self-protection. So you see it from the title Angela Brown, When Battered Women Kill. So whenever women kill or perpetrate violence against men, it was mostly seen as a response to violence from men in the first place. And then another book, you can see those Dobash books, and that's Changing Violent Men. So when it comes to the implications of this theoretical perspective, so what do we do about domestic violence? In other words, how do we help women? By changing violent men. So you see, that is why it's so important to look into what are these theoretical grounds behind the area, because we see what kind of questions we ask, and then what kind of answers we get, and what we use it to build the entire work for implications. So this is one of the source for the controversy. So men just don't fit here. They just not seen as victims. They are seen as perpetrators, violent perpetrators. They may be killed by battered women, and it's important to change those violent men. So the second source of controversy about even talking about men then, about male victims, is that they just don't fit that image of the perfect victim. Perfect victim is a term from criminology explaining that we feel sympathy, we want to help those who are weak or who needs our help. Men just not there. Even when we talk about children, we talk about the children and women being weak. And even when women express anger, it's just this idea that what have they done to her, right, to deserve that type of reaction? And of course, the case of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, maybe some of you followed that, trial and know what happened. I think it very much illuminated some of the issues that male victims experience in actually proving that they were victim, and that audio tape that Johnny Depp had was very important where Amber Heard admitted that she actually hurt him. She even cut part of his finger. There were incidents of physical violence and psychological abuse there in the relationship. So, but again, many had difficulties with seeing Johnny Depp as a victim because he's just not a perfect victim. And then last type of controversy, and this is something that again I've just identified as one of the barriers to really talk about men, is just about the traditional expectations about the man, real man, and masculinity. So men should be strong, men should be should not be weak, and of course not abused by a woman. And in this case, this is the picture showing Charivari um, tradition when the abused men were treated like this. So they were not helped, or the people didn't express sympathy or empathy towards this man. They were actually laughed at, put backwards on the donkey, and put through the streets of this town, where people would humiliate men even further, punishing them for violating the norms of real masculinity, be strong and be in control. And of course, so many stereotypes in the public today. Whenever the woman slaps the man, it's not often seen as violent. It's just her expression of her femininity, right? So it's something we are very much blind in, even in the popular culture today, that it's exactly how violence looks like. But many people still don't see that this way because of these gender stereotypes. So, in terms of types of intimate partner violence, there are many of them, and you've must have heard about some of them, particularly physical violence and sexual violence, hitting partner, kicking partner, sexually abusing a partner. And then there are other forms of abuse that are also very important. And actually, there were feminist researchers who pointed attention that psychological aggression and control and abuse can be even more damaging for victims than physical violence. And this is what we see in the case of men. With the men I talked to in doing my research, they mostly told me that it was psychological aggression that was the most difficult, the most humiliating. Even not that much physical violence. Also, physical violence is also quite present in the relationship. It hurts a lot. Financial abuse and other form of abuse is illegal administrative abuse. This is something we learn about this quite recently. And this is when one of the partners uses the resources to hurt the other partner, or uses the criminal justice system, family court, police, to hurt the partner, to falsely accuse the partner, to get custody over children or some other benefits. Um, Again, this is just some of the forms, some of the terms I will be using in my presentation. So there is this big issue around, so how many are victims of male victims of abuse are out there? And this is where it becomes complicated. This is where one side, or feminist-based researchers, gender-based researchers, usually use official police data to show that male victims are very much less likely, men are much less likely to be abused than women do. But it's very important to understand that the official police data is not the only source of information. And there is another very important source of data on intimate partner violence, in some ways much more reliable. And this is Canadian General Social Survey on Victimization. So GSS, this is the survey conducted by Statistics Canada, and victimization component is conducted every 5 years. So the sample of about 30,000 people randomly selected from Canada, which means that they represent the Canadian population, are selected, and they ask questions based on the conflict tactic skills. For example, have you ever been hit by your partner? Did your partner ever kick you, or slap you in the face? So the questions do not sound like, are you a victim of abuse? Something that allows a lot of subjective interpretation. No, it's a very much behavioral scale that asks several questions that are very specific about the forms of behavior individuals experienced. In this way, we actually increase the reliability and validity of this scale. So, in any case, in terms of the official police data, I show this image here of the iceberg. So, why? In order to show that despite many great strong sides of the police statistics, just because it's It's a mandatory survey, so all police departments have to report the information back to Statistics Canada, and then they publish it every year about family-related crimes and intimate partner violence-related crimes. It's uniform across all the provinces and territories, but there is a very serious limitation of this data, something that those who quote the statistics very much try to not notice. And this is that these statistics show only the tip of the iceberg. So we only see a small proportion of cases that actually come to the attention of the police. So the violence most likely is severe enough to get attention of the police or the neighbors who call the police, or the individual who actually gets to the hospital that actually also inform the police then. And the majority of the cases actually outside of the attention of the police. How many? According to the Canadian General Social Survey on Victimization, among those people who were identified as victims of intimate partner violence, 80% of them said that they never reported these incidents to the police and they never were known to the police. 80%. So what does it mean? It means that we need to at least use two sources of information. We need to use official data, but at the same time to acknowledge its limitations and understand that these are the most serious crimes. And then there is a general social survey victimization that shows much more comprehensive picture about victimization in the population. The limitation of this source of data is that it has low chances to get to the most serious cases, right? Because serious cases are very rare, and to get them into the survey, its chances are very low. So this underrepresents the serious cases of abuse. So both sources should be used. So let's look at what the sources show. So this is if you look at the police data, and this is police reported statistics on intimate partner violence in Canada in 2018. So what you can see if you look at the left side, you can see IPV here. So this is for intimate partner violence, all recorded crime, intimate partner violence related crime. You can see that there was over 78,000 of cases against women. And there were over 20,000 cases where male were victims of intimate partner violence. And in the majority of these cases, they were female partners in a heterosexual relationship. So you see that the proportion of men is around 21% among the victims of intimate partner violence. There are more men, if you see over there, non-intimate partner violence, men are more likely to become victims of abuse, of violence overall. But when it comes to intimate partner violence within the police data, we see that women are overrepresented. But still, what we see is over 20,000 men who were victims of intimate partner violence in Canada just in 1 year. And if we look at this 20,000 men, we can see that these cases are more likely to be severe than for women. So it may suggest that only the most serious cases, when the men are involved, get to the attention of the police. Who are these men? What happened in those relationships? And how we can help them? Even looking at this source of data, we still see the violence is a very serious issue. Let's look at the General Social Survey on Victimization and look at the statistic provided by this population-based survey, where we know that the reporting rate is much higher, right? It's more reliable. So what we can see, and I show it here, in the past 20 years, 5 cycles, starting from 1999, for the first time, Statistics Canada measured intimate partner violence for both men and women. We can see that the rate was around 8, so 8.3 for women, 6.6 for men per year. In the past 5 years, these people reported victimization in the past 5 years. And little star means that the women were significantly more likely to be victims of intimate partner violence than men. But then what interesting is that what you see, that by 2019, which is the most recent statistic survey, first of all, the domestic violence rate actually declining, which is great news. And that we see there is more gender parity, gender similarity in rates. We see that in 2009, there was no differences between men and women experiencing, in numbers of men and women who experience violence. And then in 2015, there are actually more men in Canada that experienced abuse, 4.2% versus 3.5%. And then in 2019, it's reversed to 4.2% women and 2.7% of men. This would be a great news for men, seeing that there is actually decline, substantial decline from the previous cycle in 2014. The only thing we have to be careful is just because it's for the first time that Statistics Canada used the internet-based survey. So it's not quite comparable to all the previous 4 cycles. We don't know how doing it electronically rather than face-to-face interview or by the phone, we don't know how it might affect these findings and what exactly explains these differences here. But in general, you see that compared to the police statistics, the differences in the rates of men and women who experienced abuse are much smaller here. And we see this is a very good issue of the what is called gender symmetry in victimization of domestic violence. And what is also interesting is that we'll look at the only current relationships, because Statistics Canada asks about victimization in the intimate partner relationship in the past and also in the current relationships. And then we looked just at the experiences of intimate partner violence in current relationships. We see that actually this is where men are more likely to experience abuse than women do, which suggests that men may stay longer in abusive relationship than women do. And this has very serious implications for why do men stay longer? What keeps them in abusive relationship? It means that at the time of the interview with the Statistics Canada, they were in abusive relationship, right? So again, this is really important findings. I'm very glad that Statistics Canada collects this information for both men and women, because in many countries in the world, and World Health Organization, they actually do not ask men about victimization experiences. They exclude them from the surveys. They focus only on women as victims of abuse, presuming that it's the women who are abused. And then this is where I really wanted to show you that it's not that simple. And unfortunately, I don't see what is written here, but I will explain to you what these 3 proportions mean. It's not that easy. It's not just violence against women or violence against men. Now we actually know that in the majority of the violent relationship, it is both partners who are violent. It's called bidirectional violence. There are different types of dynamic in physical intimate partner violence relationships, and majority of them is bidirectional. And the left side here, the very large proportion of cases, it's over 53% of cases, or 58% of cases, 58%, close to 60% of all cases of violence in the intimate relationship, it's bidirectional. So what happens is that when Statistics Canada asked the respondents in Canada if they ever were victims of abuse, asking them if your partner hit you or kicked you, in reporters, the participants would say yes, but Statistics Canada that doesn't ask the question if you ever hit your partner or kick your partner. And it's very important omission. We actually ask Statistics Canada to include the perpetration scale, because in this case, we will have a better understanding what actually happens in the relationship, rather than just seeing these are the victims, the women are victims, men are victims. Those studies that actually asked both perpetration scale and victimization scale, we see that the majority of them actually use violence, both of them partners. So it's bidirectional, very complex. And then male-only violence, it's about in 13% of cases, and in 28% of cases, it's female-only perpetrators. This is a very important finding, very unusual, something it's hard to expect that women would initiate violence even in more cases than men. So this is interesting. This is the result of the meta-analysis, the largest to this time, conducted in 2012. And I know the group of researchers working right now on examining all the literature up to date, what if it's changed in the past 10 years. But it's very interesting to learn. But we need to understand that it's a very complex issue of intimate partner violence. In terms of the consequences of violence for men, there is this myth, and I've mentioned in the beginning. Myth means erroneous belief. Just men are just not hurt by violence. It just doesn't affect them in the same way as women. What is true is that men are much less likely to report that they experience fear in the relationship. That is true. And men are less likely to report that they've been injured than women do. And still, when we look at the men in Canada who experienced injuries, around 12% of the sample experienced injuries. There are many more women, but what about this 12% of men who are injured? Is it important to look into these cases and see how we can actually prevent these cases from happening in the first place? And then we know the group of studies, a group of researchers in the United States, my colleagues studied victims, male victims, group of male victims, very large group, actually around 600 men who were victims of abuse. And they found a lot of psychological negative consequences of abuse, including suicidal thoughts, depression, and all kind of issues and symptoms of a post-traumatic stress disorder. And even in Canada, we found that men reported some of the symptoms. 19% of the sample of male victims reported experiencing symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder. It is serious. It's not something that men just don't notice, or it just goes unnoticed and it's not severe enough. It is severe. It has serious consequences for men, and it has serious consequences for men's children in the relationship who are there to witness this abuse. There are many affective symptoms that they experience: anxiety, conduct problems, emotional problems, and so on. The next important question, so what about help seeking? So there are men, very, very many men in Canada who experience abuse. In 2014, the estimates were around over 400,000 men who were actually abused in Canada by their intimate partners, majority of whom are women. So what do these men do? Where do they go? Who do they talk to? Do they look for help? And then when we look for help-seeking behavior, we find that men are so much less likely to look for help. They just don't go to the doctors. They don't go to the police. They rarely talk to their coworkers or they don't go to shelters. And we wanted to know why. What stops men? In other words, what are the barriers for their help seeking? And the paper that my colleagues and I published in 2022 called Barriers to Male Victims Help Seeking. And these are just some of them here. So you see, we identified two major clusters of barriers. One cluster called internal barriers, internal, something related to how men think about the self and what they know about the relationship. And the second cluster of barriers is external barriers to help seeking. So we found that the internal barriers are really serious and stop men from seeking help, meaning that they will stay in abusive relationship. Abuse may escalate both for them and for their children. It can lead, unfortunately, to domestic homicide in some cases, right? And we know that when it comes to domestic homicide, in 25% of perpetrators, when the men are perpetrating homicide, in 25% of these cases, then they commit suicide. So this is really become really serious if it goes untreated and not discussed. So what are these internal barriers? They are just blind to the abuse. This is a very important barrier. We found that men have difficulties really talking about abuse. They just don't see it that way. If you describe the same situation and just change the gender of the individual in there, they will say, of course, it's abuse. Oh my God. But when it happens to them, when they are humiliated, when the partner throws things at them, controls them, checks their emails, gets into the phone, oh, she just wants to know more. Oh, she just can't. Oh, she just worries about. So they find all kind of excuses or kind of explanations. They don't see it as abuse. And if you do not call it abuse, it's very difficult to start looking for the exit in those relationship or trying to do something about it, right? And find help. Many try to normalize relationship. Men try to maintain relationship for the sake of their children and the family unit. They find themselves responsible, keep saying, oh, it's just my job to fix relationship. It's me who has to be in charge. I have to tolerate that just for my kids. Male roles, of course, being a man, and I'm embarrassed. How can I admit that I'm abused? Or how can I even tell it to anybody else? It's so shameful and embarrassing. And many excuses of women. It's very interesting that I've talked to many men, and They do not blame their partners. They do not call the names. They're just basically saying, we have to admit that she had a difficult childhood, or she has a substance use issue, and they try actually explain that happens in the relationship. And external barriers, mostly related to the idea that they experience fear with seeking help. They don't know what happens if they call the police. They think that they may be arrested. Their life will be changed forever. They will not see their kids again. They hear these stories in the news. They know it from their friends. They are afraid and nowhere to go. If they want to go, where do they go? They told me. Where do I call? I tried to call. I actually tried to Google some services. I called them. They say, sorry, we don't know how to work with you. Just need to find something else. So yes, this is another barrier. So this is a really important issue. If we want to start helping men, we need to find out what stops them in the first place and how we can address those issues. And the very important issue that I'd like today to discuss in my presentation is, of course, the presence of children and men's relationship. We talked to men, and even without asking them directly about children, they actually, many of them in our international study, talked about children. And I just give example of several themes that we identified in our work. Abuse in front of children. So that was Rob. The kids are really the Achilles heel. I never felt that she was able to penetrate my armor until the kid came along, and she was able to embarrass me, humiliate me in front of my own child. And that was when really began to suffer. So using children as weapon and to abuse men, and that was Peter. She has just denied all contact with the children on a whim, just using them as weapons. I can't see them on Father's Day, talk to them on the phone, you name it. Parental alienation, a huge issue, and some argue is a type of domestic violence and should be seen as a type of domestic violence. She took her and she paraded with false claims of domestic violence. So a lot of false allegations goes in this area. A little bit more. So some men actually, we came to this term gendered enterprise of the criminal justice system. So Meek, everything that she had accused me of doing for the criminal court that I was acquitted of, she admitted to doing to me herself. I still couldn't actually go back to my house and see my children. So the idea is that the entire system works against men. It's been designed for women to help women against men. Men just don't fit them. Cold shoulder to male victims, we called it taught this theme this way because like Damien and many other participants told us, I tried to get some help for the children because she was severely abusing the children. And the police just didn't believe me. They couldn't care less what I said. And finally, about the children, men tolerating abuse for the sake of children. And this is something that gives us an indication that men may stay in the relationship of abuse for the sake of children. For example, Martin, basically, I just kept it within the family unit. I did what I thought would be best to try to solve it, to work hard. I wanted to protect the children. Men told us, if I go, what happens to them? Right? Knowing that they will stay with the abuser. So they wanted to help be there, even though they knew that they would be abused. Lack of services for men with children, nowhere to turn. Meek, there was a point where I was witnessing my children being physically abused by their mother, and there was nowhere for me to go. There is not a shelter for an abused man and his children anywhere in the country. And we talked this before. Actually, in Canada, there was a first shelter was open in April 2021. So I think it's really important. Hopelessness and helplessness. Chris, if you have children, you can't escape, meaning you cannot escape abuse. And I really wanted to mention this term again, legal and administrative abuse. It appears that violence, intimate partner violence, is very gender specific and gender inclusive, and we have to adopt this approach to talk about violence, as I've mentioned before. Gender specific means that men and women experience it differently. While women are more likely to become victims of sexual violence in a relationship, men are more likely to become victims of psychological aggression, controlling behaviorals, and also legal and administrative abuse. So, what is it? As when the partners I've mentioned use the system, criminal justice system, family courts against the men, and this is interesting. This is the only study I know today, a large study in the United States in 2020 that actually questioned the representative sample of the American population, and they found that 8% of all Americans, around 20 million, experienced false accusations of domestic violence, child abuse, and any other forms of abuse. And there were twice more men than women who actually reported experiencing it, 11% of men. And then in the two-thirds of these cases were actually false accusations were coming from women. And in about 27% of cases, false accusation actually related or were in the context of child custody dispute. And the final thing that I'd like to mention is homicide. It's a big topic, rarely discussed, rarely discussed. It's difficult to get grants to study this issue. This is something that you have to understand that women are much more likely to be killed in the intimate relationship than men do. That is why whenever we try to ask the question, so what about men? We get the answer, you know, we have to focus on who are primarily the victims. But as I've mentioned, if we look at this issue as a very complex topic, we need to understand what happens and we need to try to prevent all deaths, including the deaths of men. So this is the picture showing from the global study on homicide in 2018. And you can see that the majority on the left side, you can see that the majority of all total homicide victims, you probably cannot see that they had total homicide victims, are men. 81% of all homicide victims in the world are men. Around 19% are women. When it comes to the family-related homicides, around a third of all homicide victims are men, and two-thirds are women. And then if we limit even further to the interpersonal relationship, so it's only between the spouses or former spouses or intimate partners, it's 18% of men who are likely to be killed in the relationship compared to the majority, 82% of women. So I think that my question was what we call invisible men. Who are these men? It's very important to focus on women, absolutely, and look for the prevention and think how we can prevent actually homicides of women from the hands of their intimate partners. But we need also to see what are these deaths are and what happens in this relationship. And I've actually looked, we did an analysis of the media cases in Canada in the past 10 years, and we have identified that the men died in the intimate relationship in 3 different types of cases. And if you look at the last one here, victim precipitation, this is what people mostly think when it comes to domestic homicide, and particularly when the men are killed. It's like men deserved it. So the women kill men because they were abusive, right? After years of abuse or in the situation of the immediate self-defense, men were killed. But look at this, women kill to protect themselves. In Canada, according to the homicide survey, it's 31% of cases when the men actually precipitated that abuse, that homicide. In 32%, men were first to attack and then they were killed. So what about other cases? What are the other cases? And we don't even have that many theories that would explain what happens then. We actually see that some cases when the victims, men were the victims of female intimate terrorism. Men were terrorized. They couldn't find help. They looked for help. They were rejected. Police were laughing at them. I look at the case when in Australia the woman was scared, screaming at her husband outside of the bar, "I will kill you today!" And the police standing nearby, and they're just laughing at it. And she kills him that night, right? So nothing was because nobody really treats it seriously, right? And then there is the victims of mutual intimate partner violence, and these are the very interesting and very important category of homicides. We know that the majority of incidents of intimate partner violence is bidirectional violence. Partners just throw at each other things, humiliating each other, fighting. Fight can get out of hand. And one who uses the weapon or throws somebody just awkwardly, it may end in homicide. So it's very important to understand various situational factors, substance use, mental illness, use of weapons. We need to work with these incidents and try to prevent homicides of both men and women. And I guess this is the final slide. I'd like to mention how to help men and their families. So what do we do about all this? First of all, it's very important to have an early education about healthy relationships. And in this early education, starting in school, it's really important to talk about that any violence perpetrated by men, perpetrated by women, by boys, by girls, by any other genders should not be tolerated. Right. So it's not something that one gender can do and one gender cannot. It's that any violence should not be used, and there are healthy relationships, and everybody should be treated with dignity. It's very important to train the professionals. It looks like even today the police officers don't really know what to do. I mean, they get this training in gender-based violence, and that is why when they have to arrest somebody, they arrest the men, because this is what they were taught about, and because men are stronger, and I mean they have the physically stronger and they taller, and this is what it's in their manual. This is what it says: if the partner is actually physically stronger, they presents more potential for injury, you arrest them. So again, it's not always the case, we know that. um, it's important to challenge existing stereotypes about victims, only women as victims and only men as perpetrators. It's important to train professionals to really understand the complexity of relationship, to do better screening of the couples and provide different type of interventions. It's very important to focus on victims regardless of gender. After all, this is the law, right? This is the law, to treat people and help people regardless of the gender, right? Media plays very important role. It is important to talk about male stories. We need to hear males' voices. People should understand, really, is it really happening? This is what I hear often. Oh, really? I can't imagine that. So we need to really people to imagine it and hear the stories and really feel more empathy than towards these victims. And it's also very important to promote agency among men themselves, for men to take the control in their own hands and fight for their safety, right? To try to work about this and find the ways to be more active and proactive. And I thank you, your group and your podcast, for bringing attention to this, because I think this is all part of it, something that actually helps so many men, their loved ones, to really create that foundation, create the basis. Thank you so much. That was what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Dr. Alexandra. Truly appreciate this. I have a couple of questions on our social media platforms. Um, Before I do that, Bill, do you have any questions for Dr. Alexandra, or we should go through the questions first and then we can.
Well, I just again, I had the opportunity to speak with Alexandra before, and your information and your presentation is incredible. It's very informative, and I hope there are people that this will help today. I see a number of questions people are asking, and we'll try to get those questions out and see if you can answer them for people.
All right. So is it okay to take a slide off the screen for now, Doctor?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this stream. So our first question is on our YouTube channel, and I have the question showing below. How do we break the stereotypes that forces men to suffer in silence for the fear of not being believed, or the stigmatization of being called weak?
I think this is the answer to this question we heard from the men themselves. We actually asked this question to them. What do you think can help you, or could help you earlier, to recognize abuse and do something about it and find a way out or help yourself? And they told us, we need to hear more stories. We need to know there are other men out there. We're not alone. This is a very strong feeling that alienates men and keeps them in their shell, in their relationship, because they think it's just me. It's probably just me. And they're afraid to really reveal what happens to them, to the outside world, because of the stigmatization and fear of not being believed. And those men who participated in our interviews, in our focus groups with other abused men, they actually said, oh my God, it's so important. There are other men. We know that they stayed in touch to each other, because they said this is what important. When men know that there are other men who are suffering, and then this issue is treated seriously in the society, and you can see the reports coming from Statistics Canada that called violent victimization of men, it stops being very much prohibited topic for discussion. It's just people feel it's a very difficult, it's traumatizing experience, but people actually can reveal it. And I'd like to point out that this is something that happened about 40, 50 years ago with female victims. Nearly the same struggles when they didn't feel that they can talk to anybody about that, and they believed people will laugh at them, will not treat them seriously. And look at this now, how it all changed, right? People would not question very much the experiences of women at this point. So yes, we see that similar dynamics should happen for men.
Our next question, it's on a Facebook page. Are there video tutorials for men on how to identify and respond to being in an intimate partner-violence situation?
Yes, actually. What I just told even Bill before we started the show is that something is changing. There is much more materials right now, how to help male victims, about male victim stories. I know there is a lot of information coming from the United Kingdom, from Australia. In the United States, there are a number of centers working to help male victims. In Canada, there is a Canadian Center for Men and Families, and they create those videos, tutorials, and information. Very helpful. Yes, you can find video tutorials. You can find information about, even if you just put it, myths about male victims of domestic violence from different countries. There is information. There is 1, 2, 3. And whenever you read information about domestic violence meant for women, even though they don't mention women, it applies to men as well. We know that it applies. So yes, if you can say check here, check here, check here, it means it's abuse. It's there.
Thank you. Another question from Facebook. Are there best practices for dealing with IPV?
Yes, there are. I think the good news in this country is that something is changing in terms of the intimate partner violence. And as I showed you, in the past 20 years, there was a substantial decline in intimate partner violence victimization. This country is doing something right about it. So it looks like the media attention to the issues, the laws, the funding that provides helps for victims of abuse, the information resources, something's working. There are more specific programs that are tailored for the batterers or for the victims. And I know there is this literature, it's constantly developing on what are exactly the best programs, right? Duluth models, I'm not sure if you know about it, the feminist-based models are not found as very effective because they very much kind of blame the man and do not recognize abuse in women. But there are more programs, cognitive behavioral programs right now. They find they so much more effective for both men and women. I talked to some men here in British Columbia, and they tell me that they loved some programs like 12-step program they have. They say, we love it. It changed my life. So yes, there are very good practices at the societal level, at more individual level as well.
Now, before we come to the next question, I have a follow-up question to the same one.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned that Canada is doing very well in this in this regard. Unfortunately, for some of us that live in Canada, we don't feel that Canada is doing enough to address the issues of men. You take for example, men's shelter. For example, there's only one men's shelter in the whole country, and that's in Toronto. I was reading a couple of materials over the week. Most of the grants goes to women to address violent behaviors against women and children, and somehow animals are treated much better than men. So what's the what sources do you rely on just to make some men that are following us tonight more comfortable and somehow assured that something is being done to address the issues of men?
I think when I answer this question, I'm talking about intimate partner violence in general. And since I came from another country, from Russia, and I compare, and I like to look at the different countries and to look at the experiences of intimate partner violence in different countries, in Germany, in the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, Russia. I see that in Russia, nothing really changes. In the past 20 years, the rate of violence doesn't decline. It's just there in the same 25% of victims, and it's mostly women, right? Because men are just not even asked these questions still. So when I compare those experiences with what happens in Canada, it looks better because here There is a certain decline in victimization for both men and women, and we having this discussion at this point. And I'm seeing that in the past 10 years, some my colleagues looked into the simply number of papers on male victims in the past 10 years, and it's just this increase. It's just growing. The studies coming from different countries in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, male victims of abuse, male victims of controlling behavior, male victims. So we see this constantly. So I think what is changing is it's getting more attention. Again, we're so far away from really saying that we're solving this issue, so much far away, particularly when it comes to the federal government and federal funding, but something is changing. So I'm sometimes I'm very pessimistic, and sometimes I'm a little bit more optimistic when I see more work is done. It's a slow process, and I hope there will be more shelters. It's great that we have one. I know some countries still don't have any. Some countries still don't have any discussion on male victims. It's still taboo topic to even bring it up in the scientific conferences. So I think it's just the beginning of a very important process, and everyone in different areas should keep talking, bringing this up, doing research, organizing groups. So this is important. This is how it goes. It unfortunately cannot change overnight. It cannot
Right.
become there is no perfect solution just right now.
That's true. Thank you so much. I have another question from Wes, watching us on YouTube as well. Um, and his question reads: I heard Dr. Lysova mention a study in the US. Is there a reference to that study which we can read or find on the internet?
You probably mean the study on um, administrative abuse, false allegations. I think maybe
Yeah,
this one.
yeah.
Yeah, yes, it's available online. If you just put it, so is it? Yeah, you can find it. It's available. You can see the entire file. You can see the questions. You can see this is how we found it. So it's a gov. I need to get back to the slide exactly. It's
Okay,
the yeah. If
I'll bring
or
it up.
I can send a link later, and then yeah. So I'll just let you know right away.
Mhm,
If you go, yeah. So it's a YouGov survey.
mhm.
YouGov government survey. If you just put YouGov survey 2020 in the search, and if you can just include maybe false accusations, you may find this study online. And if you still have difficulties, please email me at alysova@sfu.ca, and I will be happy to share with you the link and the study.
Thank you so much. And then we have another question from Kelsey. I believe you are familiar with Kelsey. He's watching us on YouTube. And his question reads: Who does training? Who does training regarding IPV targeted at men for police?
I think this is what I'm aware of is in Ontario. My colleague and I, my colleague from the United States and I, we just developed the training for the police. And I think people from CCMF trying to find the way to start training or the Ontario police with that training, with that materials that we developed. So I hope it will become the norm. I think it's a lot of work behind the scene is if the police is willing to get the training, and how they actually administratively go about it, I don't know. But I know that some people from CCMF actually are planning to do that.
Is this a training document public or it's a private document that is,
Yeah, at this
mostly
point, it's
used?
something that we share just with the CCMF because
Okay,
they arranged it. We did it for them for explicit for this work, but it's very much
okay,
based on what I've discussed today. Simply to acknowledge that it's very complex. It's not always shouldn't be automatically that the man held responsible. Um, yeah, so yeah, and I think it's a question that it's interesting to study to look into how they actually do that in the United States. I think I've seen some websites where they say they provide training for the police, some non-governmental organization as well that help men. So I think there are ways to do that. It's not that straightforward yet, but there are ways.
okay. Now, from a public perspective, is there any training? Let's say Bill, wants to walk into a community organization and want to somehow create awareness on IPV. Is there any training material or documentation that Bill can just reference to and be able to provide an effective training
Mhm.
to the community.
If you're asking about the effective training for the community,
Right. Not beyond the podcast, right? Is there any
yeah.
documentation or any material that can be
Oh
used to train
yeah.
our communities?
I think the internet is a great source of information now, and as I've mentioned, there are so many resources in Canada. If you just go on the CCMF website, and when we do research, for example, we share the email and the phone number of the CMF in Toronto, in Vancouver, in other provinces. There are many programs, there are many materials, there's a wonderful conference, Momentum Conference, that is conducted in every year in December. There are very interesting speakers there. So materials are plenty. And what I know, there are researchers in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Australia. We do our work, we try to make it public, so it's published as research papers, but at the same time, there are a lot of recordings on the experiences of male victims right now. You can find resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Alexandra. Bill, any questions from you? I know you've been quiet, no, listening.
Yeah, I was just looking. There's a Facebook user who made a number of posts, and I'm just going to highlight this one here.
Okay.
I saw myself as the person who was responsible for fixing the situation. In their previous questions and comments, they were talking about their relationship and how it was not healthy, and they were the victims of abuse. But again, this was the next response, and you highlighted this in talking to male victims of intimate partner violence, that they felt alone.
Mhm.
And they felt responsible and guilty for being in the situation they were in. Didn't recognize themselves as being victims of abuse, but if they were asked if the same behavior was perpetrated against a woman, they would definitely recognize it as a form of violence and abuse. So I just wanted to highlight the comment of this person, this Facebook
Actually,
user.
yeah, can we post the entire comment, Bill?
Sure, I'll put the comment here. This is
Okay.
I entered into a relationship with a woman on and off for 10 years. She would come and go. I lost confidence and sense of my self-worth. In the interim, I got into a relationship with an abuser who hit and kicked and punched and tried to stab or drag me into situations where she could be hurt, grabbing steering wheels, breaking dishes, and trying to drag me into the floor, attacking me with my child in my arms. This person, their next line was, I saw myself as the person who was responsible for fixing the situation. Again, I personally, I recognize the guilt and shame associated with being the victim of intimate partner violence and not necessarily recognizing that fact. So it's important, like you said, men need to speak up and speak out so that other men know they're not alone in being victims of this type of abuse, so they can get help and they can recover from what they just see as a normal situation that they have to deal with. It's not a normal situation. It's an abusive situation, and you need help and you need support. And anyone who is going through any kind of abuse like that, please reach out. You need to find a support group, and you need some resources to help you get through this situation.
It was very painful for me to hear. One man said, I've been 12 years in this abusive relationship, never thinking about them as abusive, and now I can see it. But it's 12 years of my life. So, and this is so painful to understand that you cannot just go back and, reclaim that time. So yes, the earlier you look for help, the earlier you reach out. If something bothers you, you just feel something is not right, the more chances you get help and realize and end those relationships just because they're not healthy. They're most likely abusive, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say, I think we're getting close to the end of our time. I was just going to turn it over to you, and I'd just like to say thank you, Alexandra, for taking the time again. I was it's learned so much from speaking and hearing you speak about these issues and the statistics you provided. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time again to share it with us and everyone else.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're all
and yeah, thank you so much. We would love to have you back. I mean, the information you've shared, it's so useful to a lot of the men that are watching, not just men, but there are young adults as well that are watching us, and there are women as well that are following us. One thing I believe is that nobody needs to be abused. Nobody needs to go through any form of abuse. It doesn't matter whether you're a male, female, or a child. Nobody deserves to go through that. And I truly appreciate all the information we shared, and we would truly love to have you back again in the future. I think you've been very helpful to us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody who was listening. Thank you.
All right. So if you can just stay for a few minutes, I'm just gonna go offline, and then I'll be with you in a few minutes. Yes.